We live in an age of unprecedented comfort and speed. Technology has made life easier, faster, and more efficient than ever before. Information travels instantly. Convenience surrounds us in almost every aspect of daily life. From the outside, human life appears more advanced, more secure, and more successful than in any previous era. And yet, something does not align. Anxiety, fear, inner tension, and quiet dissatisfaction have not decreased. In many cases, they have intensified. People surrounded by comfort still feel restless. People who appear successful still carry a subtle sense of instability within. Even in societies where basic needs are met, the heart often remains unsettled. This contrast invites a deeper question. If progress in the outer world does not bring inner stability, then perhaps the source of our unrest lies somewhere else, somewhere much closer than we usually look. Perhaps the real issue is not a lack of resources, safety, or opportunity, but an untrained mind moving through constant change without inner grounding. We have learned how to organize the world. We know how to build systems, manage structures, and expand control. But we are rarely taught how to understand the movements of our own mind, how to relate skillfully to fear, desire, frustration, and uncertainty. When the mind is not trained, even a comfortable life can become a source of tension. And when the mind is unstable, no environment, however ideal, can offer lasting peace. This is where spiritual practice truly begins. Not as a belief system, not as a cultural label, and not as an escape from modern life. Practice begins with a simple, honest question. Is this mind stable enough to live in a world that is constantly changing? If the problem lies in the mind, what does spiritual practice truly mean beyond religion, labels, and identity? Practice is not a label, but an inner responsibility. When people experience suffering, many turn toward religion as a refuge. This in itself is not wrong. But if we look honestly, religion does not automatically bring peace. In some cases, it even becomes a source of division. The problem is not the teachings. No genuine spiritual tradition teaches hatred, violence, or harm. The problem arises when religion turns into an identity to defend, a label that separates us from them. At that point, practice no longer functions as a path of inner transformation. It becomes something external, a badge, a ritual, a cultural habit, while the mind continues to operate in the same old patterns of fear, pride, and self-protection. When practice stays on the surface, belief replaces understanding and habit replaces awareness. Real Dharma does not live in names or affiliations. It lives in how the mind moves from moment to moment. It shows itself in how we think under pressure, how we speak when emotions arise, and how we act when things do not go our way. If practice does not soften the way we react, if it does not reduce harm in our words and actions, then the Dharma remains outside us, no matter how devoted we appear. This is why many people with no religious identity can live with kindness, responsibility, and care for others, while some who strongly identify as practitioners still create pain around them. What truly matters is not the label we carry, but the degree to which our mind has been trained to respond with clarity rather than habit. From this understanding, the idea of universal responsibility naturally emerges. Universal responsibility does not belong to any single religion, nation, or group. It simply recognizes one truth. Each mind influences the world it touches. When the mind is filled with anger, fear, or resentment, that state quietly spreads into relationships, families, and communities. And when the mind becomes calmer and more compassionate, that stability also radiates outward, even without intention. Practice, then, is not a private escape from the world. It is a responsibility toward the shared human space we all inhabit. To care for the mind is to care for the world in a very direct way. And this responsibility cannot be delegated to beliefs, institutions, or identities. It begins and ends with the individual mind. If transformation is not about labels or identities, where does suffering truly begin? Outside us in the world or inside us in the way the mind reacts? Suffering comes more from reaction than from events. If we observe carefully, we begin to notice something very revealing. The same situation can affect different people in completely different ways. One person remains calm, another becomes deeply distressed. One feels hurt and angry, another remains untouched by the same words or circumstances. This shows us something important. Suffering does not arise solely from events themselves. It arises from the way the mind receives, interprets, and reacts to those events. If suffering were caused only by external conditions, then everyone exposed to the same situation would suffer equally. But that is clearly not the case. This difference points us inward. It suggests that the decisive factor is not outside, but within the patterns of the reacting mind. Emotions such as anger, jealousy, and fear do not appear randomly. They arise when the mind is guided by attachment and self-protection. When the sense of me feels threatened, even small situations can feel dangerous. A simple comment becomes an insult. A minor loss becomes a personal failure. The reaction happens quickly, often before we are even aware of it, and once the reaction takes over, the mind believes it is justified. What we rarely notice is that these emotions are not protecting us. They are repeating familiar patterns rooted in grasping and fear. When these patterns remain unseen, they quietly shape how we experience the world, again and again. Some forms of suffering are loud and obvious. Others are very subtle. Subtle suffering does not shout. It lingers quietly as chronic tension, as constant dissatisfaction, as a vague sense that something is never quite right. Because it lasts so long, we begin to treat it as normal. We assume that this is simply what life feels like. But when suffering becomes familiar, it becomes invisible. And when it is invisible, it remains unexamined and unchanged. This is why changing external conditions alone rarely brings lasting relief. A new situation replaces the old one, but the same reactions follow. Without transforming the way the mind reacts, the cycle continues even when circumstances improve. So if reaction is the root of suffering, how do we train the mind without suppressing emotions or running away from them? Training the mind As daily mental hygiene, we understand the importance of physical hygiene. When the body is dirty, we wash it. When it is tired, we allow it to rest. We do this naturally, without guilt or judgment. But when it comes to the mind, we often forget that it also needs regular care. Emotions such as anger, jealousy, resentment, or fear can remain in the mind for a long time without being noticed. When these states are left unattended, they slowly shape how we see the world, how we relate to others, and how we experience ourselves. An untrained mind, like an unwashed body, does not become problematic overnight. It becomes heavy, tense, and unbalanced over time, simply because it has not been cared for. Training the mind does not begin with control or suppression. It begins with recognition. When anger arises, we quietly acknowledge, "This is anger." When fear appears, we recognize, "This is fear." This simple act of naming creates a small but crucial gap. In that gap, the mind is no longer completely fused with the emotion. We are aware of it rather than being carried by it. This moment of awareness is not dramatic. It does not remove the emotion instantly, but it restores something very important: choice. Instead of reacting automatically, we regain the ability to pause, to breathe, and to respond with a little more clarity and care. Mind training is not about becoming a perfect or always calm person. It is about patient repetition. Again and again, we notice what is arising. Again and again, we pause instead of reacting. Sometimes the gap is very small, sometimes we miss it completely, and that is part of the practice. Over time, these small moments of recognition accumulate. The mind gradually becomes more stable, more flexible, and less compelled to follow old habits. Practice, in this sense, is not a special activity reserved for meditation sessions. It happens in conversations, in moments of stress, and in everyday interactions. Each time we recognize instead of react, mental hygiene is being practiced. But even if the mind becomes calmer, why do we still keep chasing pleasure as if it could give lasting peace? Sensory pleasure is real. It brings genuine enjoyment and relief in the moment. Good food tastes good. Comfort feels comforting. Beautiful sights and sounds can lift the heart. The Dharma does not deny this, but it asks us to look more carefully. If we observe closely, we see that pleasure is always short-lived and dependent on conditions. It arises when the right causes come together and fades as soon as those causes change. What felt satisfying a moment ago quickly loses its intensity, and what once delighted us soon feels ordinary. This does not mean pleasure is wrong. It simply means it cannot provide lasting stability. When the mind relies on pleasure for peace, it is depending on something that is constantly changing. There is another subtle aspect of sensory pleasure. Repetition dulls joy. The same experience, repeated again and again, no longer brings the same satisfaction. What once excited us slowly becomes neutral or even boring. At the same time, pleasure easily invites comparison. We notice what others have, what they enjoy, what they seem to possess in greater measure. From comparison arises dissatisfaction. From dissatisfaction arises subtle resentment, and from resentment, the sense of lack deepens. Even when life conditions improve, the mind quietly finds new reasons to feel incomplete. This cycle continues not because the world is deficient, but because pleasure was never meant to carry the weight of lasting happiness. When this is not understood, the search for satisfaction never truly ends. Attachment to pleasure creates another hidden burden, the fear of loss. When something feels pleasant, the mind wants to hold it, and when it wants to hold it, fear naturally follows. We fear losing what we enjoy. We fear change. We fear decline. This fear does not always appear dramatically. Often it becomes a quiet background tension, a subtle anxiety woven into daily life. The Dharma does not ask us to reject joy or to withdraw from the world. It simply asks us to see clearly what pleasure can and cannot offer. Joy can be enjoyed, but it cannot be trusted as a final refuge. When the mind understands this distinction, it stops demanding from pleasure what pleasure was never meant to give. If external pleasure cannot be our final refuge, what kind of path can truly train the mind in a reliable and lasting way? The Nalanda spirit. Understand. Before you believe in the Nalanda tradition, spiritual practice is not built on blind faith. It is grounded in understanding. Teachings are not meant to be accepted simply because they are ancient, authoritative, or widely respected. They are meant to be examined. We listen to the teachings. We reflect on them carefully. We question what we hear, and most importantly, we test them in our own lived experience. If a teaching helps reduce greed, anger, and confusion, if it brings more clarity and compassion into daily life, then it has value. Faith in this tradition is not the starting point. It is the natural result of seeing for oneself that a teaching actually works. This approach protects practice from superstition and keeps it grounded in reality. Reason alone, however, is not enough. Understanding must be accompanied by compassion. Without compassion, wisdom can become dry, detached, or even subtly arrogant. The Nalanda spirit holds reason and compassion together. Reason prevents us from falling into blind belief. Compassion prevents understanding from becoming cold. When insight is joined with care for suffering, wisdom remains human and alive. It stays connected to real people, real pain, and real responsibility. This balance allows practice to remain relevant in modern life. It does not ask us to withdraw from society or abandon relationships. Instead, it asks us to bring clarity into how we think, speak, and act within the world as it is. In this tradition, the Dharma is often compared to a map. A map shows direction. It helps us avoid unnecessary detours. But a map cannot walk for us. If we only study the map, memorize its details, and admire its accuracy, nothing in our life actually changes. Walking the path is our responsibility. No one can do it on our behalf. At the same time, walking without a map can lead to confusion and wrong turns. This is why understanding and practice must move together. Knowing where to go and actually taking steps are equally necessary. When this balance is present, the path begins to feel clear, grounded and workable, not abstract or distant. If the path needs a clear spine to hold everything together, what is the simplest framework that can contain the whole Dharma without confusion or excess? Pillar 1. Renunciation. Right seeing, not escape. Renunciation is often misunderstood. It is not hatred of life. It is not rejection of family, work, or responsibility. And it is not an attempt to escape the world. Renunciation begins with clarity. It is the clear seeing that everything within samsara, comfort, success, pleasure, recognition, no matter how attractive, cannot offer lasting peace. This understanding does not arise from pessimism. It arises from honest observation. We notice how satisfaction fades, how achievement brings new pressure, and how relief is always temporary. When this seeing becomes steady, the mind slowly stops placing its deepest hope in what cannot truly support it. Renunciation, then, is not turning away from life. It is turning away from illusion. As illusion weakens, clinging naturally loosens. There is no need to force detachment. There is no need to reject enjoyment or comfort. When the mind sees clearly, attachment loses its grip on its own. We still live in the world. We still participate in daily life. But something subtle changes. We stop demanding that life provide what it cannot. We stop expecting permanence from what is impermanent. And because of this, the mind becomes lighter, less desperate, less driven by constant craving. Renunciation does not drain life of meaning. It removes unrealistic expectations. When expectations soften, frustration softens as well. And when frustration softens, the mind gains the space needed for deeper transformation to begin. Renunciation gives direction to practice. Without it, spiritual effort can easily become decoration, something added on to an unchanged life. Practice may continue, but the heart remains invested in the same old promises of samsara. With renunciation, practice becomes serious, not rigid, but sincere. The mind knows what it is turning away from and why. It knows that freedom cannot be found by refining old habits or by perfecting temporary pleasures. This clarity gives the path a forward direction. It prevents practice from drifting or becoming merely comforting. Renunciation is the quiet decision to stop searching for lasting peace in places where it has never been found. And this decision prepares the heart for the next essential movement of the path. But if we seek freedom only for ourselves, doesn't the path become narrow? What opens the heart beyond the limits of the self? Pillar 2. Bodhicitta, the heart that expands the path. Bodhicitta is often misunderstood as simple kindness or sentimental compassion. But bodhicitta is not an emotion that comes and goes, and it is not pity directed from one person to another. Bodhicitta is a fundamental shift of motivation. Instead of seeking freedom only for oneself, the heart turns toward awakening for the benefit of all beings. This shift changes the entire direction of the path. Practice is no longer driven solely by personal relief or the wish to escape discomfort. It is guided by a wider intention, to reduce suffering wherever it appears, both within oneself and in others. Because of this, Bodhicitta gives practice a strength and endurance that self-centered motivation cannot sustain. Seeing shared suffering is at the core of bodhicitta. When we look honestly, we recognize that our own pain is not fundamentally different from the pain of others. Everyone seeks happiness, everyone fears loss, everyone struggles with uncertainty. This recognition softens the sense of separation. The sharp boundary between me and you begins to loosen, and as separation weakens, defensiveness naturally decreases. Compassion does not arise from obligation. It arises from understanding. When we see that suffering follows the same patterns everywhere, the heart responds with care rather than judgment. In this way, bodhicitta does not make us fragile. It makes us more stable, less easily shaken by small personal concern. Without bodhicitta, renunciation can become dry and isolated. The mind may turn away from attachment, but it can also withdraw from connection. Practice becomes inward-focused, sometimes rigid, sometimes disconnected from the world. Bodhicitta prevents this imbalance. It keeps the path warm, human, and engaged. When the heart remains open, renunciation does not lead to cold distance. It leads to clarity combined with care. With bodhicitta, practice is no longer a private journey of self-improvement. It becomes a shared path of responsibility and service. This expanded motivation naturally invites a deeper question to arise. If we wish to help others in a lasting way, what understanding is needed to address suffering at its very root? Even with a wide and compassionate heart, what finally cuts the deepest root of suffering? The belief in a solid, separate me. Pillar 3. Wisdom. Seeing reality as it is. In the Dharma, wisdom is not the accumulation of information. It is not philosophical knowledge or intellectual brilliance. Wisdom is insight. It is the direct seeing of how reality actually functions. At the heart of this wisdom is dependent origination. Everything arises in dependence on causes and conditions. Nothing exists on its own, unchanging and independent. When this is not seen, the mind assumes solidity where there is none. We take experiences, emotions, and identities to be more fixed than they really are. Wisdom begins by questioning these assumptions. It asks us to look carefully at what we habitually take to be real, and to examine whether it truly exists in the way we believe it does. This investigation is not abstract. It is grounded in direct observation of lived experience. One of the most important discoveries of wisdom concerns the sense of self. When we search for a solid, independent me, we cannot find it. It is not located in the body alone. It is not found in thoughts or emotions, and it does not exist apart from them either. The self appears as a convenient designation, a name given to a collection of changing processes. When conditions change, the sense of self changes as well. Seeing this does not erase personal experience. Pain is still felt. Joy is still known. Responsibility still functions. But the belief in a fixed entity that must be protected at all costs begins to loosen. As this belief weakens, many of the reactions rooted in fear and defensiveness also begin to soften. This insight is often explained through the teaching of two truths. On the conventional level, the world functions as we experience it. Actions have consequences, relationships exist, ethical responsibility matters. On the ultimate level, no phenomenon exists independently or inherently. Everything is empty of fixed self-nature. Understanding both truths together prevents confusion. Emptiness does not negate the world, and convention does not contradict emptiness. When this balance is understood, wisdom becomes liberating rather than destabilizing. Grasping loosens. Fear softens. Rigid self-protection is no longer required. The mind does not collapse into nothingness. It becomes more flexible, more open, and less compelled to defend illusions. This is how wisdom directly touches the deepest root of suffering. So how do these three pillars, renunciation, bodhicitta, and wisdom, support one another so that practice does not become cold, dry, or misguided? Why all three must be united? Each pillar of the path has its own function. Renunciation reduces attachment. It loosens the grip of craving and turns the mind away from false promises. Bodhicitta expands the heart. It widens motivation beyond the narrow circle of the self and connects practice to the suffering of others. Wisdom dissolves ignorance. It cuts through the belief in a solid, separate self that lies at the root of fear and grasping. Each of these qualities is essential, but none of them is complete on its own. When they arise together, they form a balanced and living path. When one is missing, practice begins to lean, losing clarity, warmth, or depth. Wisdom without compassion can easily become cold. The mind may see clearly, but the heart remains distant. Insight turns into detachment, and understanding loses its human warmth. On the other hand, compassion without wisdom can become blind or even harmful. We may sincerely wish to help, but without clear seeing, our actions can reinforce dependency, confusion, or unintended suffering. This is why the path emphasizes the union of method and wisdom. Method refers to compassion, care, and skillful means. Wisdom refers to clear insight into reality. When these two support each other, compassion becomes effective, and wisdom remains alive and responsive to real human suffering. Renunciation, bodhicitta, and wisdom do not operate in separate stages. They function together, moment by moment. Renunciation prevents the mind from chasing old habits. Bodhicitta prevents the heart from closing in on itself. Wisdom prevents both from being guided by illusion. When these three are united, practice becomes both gentle and precise. It does not fall into indulgence, and it does not fall into harshness. The path becomes steady, flexible, and responsive to life as it is. This union is not an abstract ideal. It is something to be lived, and it naturally raises the next question. How does this integration appear in the ordinary moments of daily life? Practice. In daily life, spiritual practice does not live apart from daily life. It lives inside it. Every reaction becomes a training ground. Every moment of irritation, fear, disappointment, or desire is an invitation to practice. We often think that practice happens only in quiet moments, only in meditation, only when life feels calm. But real transformation happens when the mind is challenged, when something does not go our way, when emotions arise unexpectedly. These moments reveal our habits clearly. They show us where attachment still grips, where fear still drives reactions, and where awareness has not yet taken root. Instead of seeing these moments as failures, the path asks us to see them as opportunities, not to judge ourselves, but to observe, learn, and gently adjust the direction of the mind. In these ordinary moments, the three pillars work together very simply. Renunciation reminds us not to chase the impulse immediately. We pause instead of reacting. We do not feed the urge to defend, attack, or escape. Bodhicitta reminds us to consider the impact of our response. How will these words affect the other person? How will this reaction shape the shared space between us? Wisdom reminds us that emotions are not solid or permanent. They arise due to conditions and pass when those conditions change. Seen this way, anger is not an enemy, fear is not a command, and desire is not an order. They become experiences to be understood, not forces to be obeyed. Practice unfolds through small moments, repeated again and again. One pause instead of a reaction, one breath instead of a harsh word, one moment of clarity instead of automatic identification. These moments may feel insignificant, but they accumulate quietly. Over time, the mind becomes less reactive, the heart becomes less defensive, and wisdom becomes more accessible in the middle of life, not only at its edges. Transformation does not announce itself. It happens silently, through consistency rather than intensity. This is why the path does not demand perfection. It asks only for sincerity and willingness to begin again. Each small moment lived with awareness moves the path forward, not dramatically, but reliably. If the path is lived in these small, ordinary moments, what is the simplest reminder we can carry into tomorrow? Walk the path. Don't stand outside it. It is important not to turn the Dharma into a distant ideal or a standard by which we judge ourselves. When the teachings become something we compare ourselves to, practice quietly turns into pressure. We feel that we are never enough, never practicing well enough, never living up to what we understand. But the Dharma was never meant to sit above life as a measuring stick. It was meant to walk with us, step by step, inside ordinary experience. Real change does not arrive dramatically. It does not announce itself. It unfolds quietly, through small shifts in how we relate to what arises. Practice is deeply human. It allows mistakes. It allows learning. And it allows returning again and again without harsh self-judgment. Transformation rarely looks impressive from the outside. It happens gradually, often unnoticed even by ourselves. A little less reactivity, a little more space before speaking, a little more care in moments that once felt automatic. These changes may seem small, but they matter. Every moment of awareness counts. Every time we recognize rather than react, the path is being lived. The Dharma does not enter our life through perfect understanding or flawless practice. It enters through the next step we take, the next word we choose, the next reaction we soften, the next moment we meet with clarity instead of habit. In this way, the Dharma slowly moves from being something we know to something we embody. Standing outside the path, we may understand many teachings yet remain unchanged. Walking the path, even imperfectly, the teachings begin to work within us. The Dharma becomes inside us, not when we can explain it clearly, but when it quietly alters how we meet life. It shows itself in how we respond to difficulty, in how we treat others, and in how gently we relate to ourselves. Nothing more is required. No special conditions, no ideal version of practice, just the willingness to bring awareness into the next moment and then the next. That is how the path continues. Not all at once, but faithfully, through simple, lived steps. Thank you for walking through this reflection. There is nothing more you need to add, nothing you need to become. The path does not ask for perfection. It asks only for presence. If even one moment in this reflection helped you pause, breathe, or see your experience more gently, then the Dharma has already begun to live through you. Carry it quietly into your day, into your next conversation, into your next reaction, and let the path continue not as an idea, but as a way of being.